So I invite you to just take a deep breath and come fully present into this moment, letting go of worries or thoughts about what might happen later today or later this week. Simply become present as I invite the bowl to sound. Come fully present in your body and in this moment. Today we're talking about how the past carries forward into the present and the future. We're talking about how the actions and choices and experiences of our ancestors changes who we are and how we respond to the world, and how we can then respond to those instinctive, unconscious impulses in a way that transforms the world for the better. You know that it is Father's Day, and in honor of all people who serve as parents or mentors or guides to younger people, we're going to take a moment to just be aware of our connection to those who have parented or mentored us, and to those that we will influence in future generations. The words for our chalice lighting come from former Senator Paul Tsongas. We are a continuum. Just as we reach back to our ancestors for our fundamental values, so we as guardians of the legacies must reach ahead to our children and their children. Let us do so with a sense of sacredness in that reaching. So before we hear from our guest speaker this morning, who I'm very excited for you to hear from, I'm going to invite you to take a minute to reflect. We're going to reflect on those who came before us. So I invite you to think of one or two people, might be groups of people, might be whole families or whole cultures. Just invite into your thoughts some people who have gone before. They may still be alive, but people who influenced you, that you are aware of as ancestors. It can be really beneficial to us to recognize and name those from the past who have influenced us, both in ways that we think are positive and ways that we think are negative. So call a couple people to mind. And notice the quality of your connection to these people. Do you notice that you have a deep emotional connection to them, or just a sort of narrative, detached stories, I've heard about them, I'm aware of them kind of connection? Notice how thinking about them feels in your body. Does it bring ease and comfort, or does it bring tension? Most of the people that have influenced us, we've seen both things that we liked and things that we did not like about them. So often our feelings are mixed. We might have some ambivalence about the people who've gone before us. So I invite you now to focus your awareness or your thoughts or your memories on a person that you feel very positive about, who influenced you. Maybe a parent, a teacher, an elder, even the story of an ancestor far back, something that you have a positive feeling about. Call that person to mind and simply thank them. Have a sense of gratitude for what they gifted you. And now I invite you to call to mind a person or a group of people that you have feelings of discomfort or anger or distress, or you don't feel comfortable, but they still were in your life somehow as a story or as a person, an elder or an ancestor that you may see as negative or may have negative feelings about. And simply hold them in your awareness for a moment. And notice what you might have learned from them, even in negative example. How you might have learned something about yourself or something that's a value for you, or that's a priority for you that they did not share. Maybe you notice some gift about being strong or making different choices that you have in your body and in your life because of their negative example. And if you are able, take a moment to forgive them, knowing that they were a product of their ancestors. Or simply let them go. And take a moment, if you can, to thank them for what you learned, even if it was through negative example. What you learned about yourself, what you learned about your world, what you learned about what's true for you or what you prefer, how maybe they spurred you to commitment or passion. Just take a moment. We learn from all those who go before us, not always in pleasant ways, but we do have the capacity to learn from everything that comes before us. So today, as we are reflecting on the effects of our ancestors and previous cultures and previous times, I invite you to hold that awareness in you, in your heart, in your thoughts, that we have the capacity, once we name and recognize and hear and feel the influence of the past in us, we have the capacity to transform that. So we have a wonderful guest speaker to share some thoughts about this with us. Carol J Baus is an amazingly interesting person. I will tell you that I've had wonderful conversations with Carol. She is an author and an educator. She does work in integrative spirituality and self-discovery with individuals and groups. She has doctorate degrees in history and psychology and is the author of a number of things. Her previous book, Neo-Shamanism and Mental Health, was published in 2019. And her more recent book that we're going to hear about, I'm going to show it to you, this book, Transgenerational Colonialism, Wounding, Overcoming, and the Reconstruction of Collective and Personal Identity, was published this year. She's also the director of the Institute of Esoteric Psychology, and the first book in her self-discovery program through that, entitled Finding the Phoenix, Tools for Self-Discovery, is going to be published in late autumn of this year. So I want to welcome Carol and encourage you to, as you are listening to her talk about transgenerational colonialism, how that has affected us, I invite you to connect in yourself with how colonialism intersects with you and your story and your ancestors.
Thank you, Carol. I appreciate it. Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a beautiful morning. It was absolutely beautiful outside for the 10 o'clock service. Just feel good. This special time, the early summer, is just kind of like no other time of year. So kind of enjoying that a lot. We all have stories, and a lot of our stories are directly related to the people who came before us, our ancestors, their cultures, and their narratives, their traditions, their talents, and their traumas. our ancestors live in our bodies physically. Their DNA is part of our DNA. And on that DNA is carried a lot of history. And one of the things that we have to kind of look at is that we are all multiplicities, and that we are made up of various ethnic and cultural and genetic elements. But one of the things we all have in common, those of us who are right here, right now, as Americans living in the United States in the 21st century, is that in our background, we all have the common denominator of colonialism. Because our ancestors, whether they wanted to come over here or not, and most of them didn't, came because their job was to basically settle and hold the land and the resources for, in the case of the United States, the British Empire. You know, people did not come over here. Our ancestors did not come over here because they, foresaw Sonics and movies and great cars and that sort of thing. Many of them had no choice. They were either transported because the British wanted them out of wherever they were. Many of them were prisoners. Many of them were indentured servants. Some were slaves. A number of them were people such as the Irish in the mid 19th century who basically could not make a living in Ireland and had no choice but to come to this country, or Australia. And so if you know the stories of your ancestors, it really helps you to go a long way to get a sense of not only what traditions and culture you've gained from them, but also what traumas, because it's these transgenerationally transmitted traumas that create a lot of our sticking points. They show up in very weird ways. People we don't like, or something comes up and we have a very strong reaction to it, positive or negative, and it's like, wow, where did that come from? Now I've done a lot of work with people doing using shamanic technique to contact their ancestors, and they see things and it's like, oh wow, that was my 3 times great grandmother on my mother's side. I heard about that. And we just are not these independent, totally autonomous organisms. We have the DNA and the oral narrative passed down in families that connects us to these people, and they are living right now through us. I don't know how many of you are aware of the science of epigenetics, which has come up fairly recently, like in the past 15, 20 years. And they're finding out some really, really cool stuff. For example, they found out that trauma actually modifies the structure of the DNA, and that's passed on. So if you're, for example, your twice or 3 times great grandmother left Ireland because there was no food after the potato blight in the mid 19th century, you're going to get triggered by that. Things that have to do with Ireland, things that have to do a lot of times with the the position of the British in Northern Ireland. These are things that do not go away. And then if you look at that, you realize that that is also triggering the people over there, which is why they're part of the reason that they're in this pattern that they currently are, and they're trying to get to the end of it, but it's part of a cycle and it's repeated. But it is in the DNA. They have also found that, for example, trauma, torture are things that are particularly carried on the male chromosome. So you might find more of that from your father's side of the family, or through your father and his ancestors, than you would from your mother's side. There are other things that are carried on through the mother's side as well. But so you've got it coming from all over. You've got it in your DNA. You've got it coming from your family and the attitudes, politics, values, talents, traditions, cultures that they pass on to you as part of your growing up. So what do we do with this? We see this playing out all over the world. We see it in our personal lives, of course, but we also see it in situations, for example, what's going on in Northern Ireland, what's going on in the Middle East. I mean, these are just recurring themes, and it seems like they've been there as long as we've been alive, because they have been. They're not new. These situations go back thousands of years. They just don't pop up out of nowhere. But what has happened is that because of the forces of colonialism and national security and all of those things that drive political decisions, there's been a real top-down approach to creating peace or some kind of semblance of living together, and why these things such as the Camp David Accord or the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland break down after a period of time is because the real issues have not been addressed. And the real issues are really on a person-to-person basis. And just as, for example, in Northern Ireland, the Irish have their story and their desire for a unified country without involvement from any outside forces, read the United Kingdom. There is a group of people who were just as adversely affected by colonialism that are represented in the Unionists, the basically largely Protestant group of people who are the descendants of the lowland Presbyterian Scots, who were moved off of their land in Scotland and told, hey, there's some great land over in Northern Ireland. We're going to move y'all over there. And if you take care of our interests over there, we'll make sure that you have a higher status than the native Irish, and that you have better jobs, and that you have the opportunity to be like any other British citizen. And of course, they bought into this. And so they, for the past 150 years, this population over there has been the beneficiary of British protection and British economic aid and infusion. As one of the dairy girls said, it's like, why should we give them anything? They've already got all the jobs, all the power, and all the land, which is how it kind of looks. But what's happened recently is that after the Unionists in Northern Ireland basically sold their souls to the British Prime Minister to get Brexit passed through the Parliament at Westminster, all bets were off. And the British basically left them, said, hey, thanks so much, you're on your own. And so now they are looking at a situation where they are no longer the majority in Northern Ireland. Now there are more people holding Irish passports that are residents of Northern Ireland than there ever have been. And the Sinn Féin party, which is an Irish party that is very, very determined to have a unified Ireland, is now the most powerful political force in Northern Ireland. And what do? The British aren't helping. The British are just, they don't care. You know, the shipyards aren't as important as they were. The foundries aren't as important as they were. So they really don't need that part of the world to be part of the United Kingdom. So they've kind of left them on their own. And what are they doing? Their paramilitaries are going and they're lobbing Molotov cocktails and exploding things in the Irish sections of Northern Ireland, like particularly Belfast and Derry. And this time it's different, though, because Sinn Féin and the Irish Republican Army know that they have the advantage. So the Irish Republican Army, which still exists, has been told, just stay at home and sit tight, because we've got this and we will have this, and we don't need to muddy the waters by creating a situation as like we had 20 years ago during the Troubles. So you look at that, and here are two stories. These are two populations that are still dealing with the blowback of British colonialism. The Good Friday Agreement was good in that it created a ceasefire from people killing each other every 5 minutes, but it did not meet the main issue. And that is that each of these groups has a legitimate worldview based in history and experience and belief. And what needs to happen, and can only happen from within those populations, is that people need to start listening to the other stories and other side story, and realize that everybody's been kind of messed up by this situation, and start getting that resonance with each other, that hearing that story, listening to that story, growing empathy. And that goes for all of us here as well, is that we all come from different bloodlines. Our ancestors have different stories, but all of the stories include elements of collective trauma. And that's just going with us as the settler colonials. And so if there's a way that we can take the common denominator of colonialism and use that as a point of resonance from which we can sit down and listen and create an empathy with the other side, in no matter what conflict that is, what can happen? That is, to me, is about the only way that we're going to get any kind of lasting, peaceful understanding. And it will take generations. It, just doesn't happen in a heartbeat. But it takes real commitment and a real desire for peace. But it changes the energy. It changes the way people are in their world if they acknowledge their pain and understand their pain and their story, and because of that can have empathy with the pain and the trauma of the other group, and work together to overcome it, to get past it, and to reconstruct an identity that is based on commonality and commitment to peace and growth, and just a much more humanistically nourishing way of life on physical, mental, and spiritual levels. So it's really kind of a call to empathy, but there's a lot that has to be worked through, and there has to really be that desire. We are just too dualistic. We tend to put things either in black or white, good guys, bad guys. It's not that simple. It's never that simple. And creating empathy is hard. It does take commitment, and it does take effort, and it takes time. So when we think about our ancestors, think about who they are and their stories, and work with them to see if they can perhaps help, awareness of them can help us to open up to creating an atmosphere of empathy and understanding as opposed to conflict and fear. And that's my little piece for today.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you. So I invite you all to just, again, take a minute and think about your ancestors. And think about them specifically in relationship to these ways of good, bad, black, white kind of thinking. You know, we've talked a lot as a community about settler colonialism as a world, the world's way of managing power and resources. That's been going on for millennia. We can go back to ancient cultures, and this model of taking from others and harming others as a way of getting resources is something that you cannot live on this planet and not have that in your ancestry, because it's the history of our planet. So we are beginning as a global community to start to name that and to talk about that. But as Carol's saying, this is personal. It's not just global, right? We have to think about, it's kind of a one person at a time thing. So think about, how do you get triggered? Where do you get triggered into good, bad, black and white, all or nothing? Think about the ways that it's hard for us to have empathy when someone's doing something that makes absolutely no sense to us, and they're looking at us thinking we make absolutely no sense, and we're sure we're right. We're all sure we're right. So I wonder, as Carol was talking, the thing I was wondering is, it's good to be aware of our own ancestors, but maybe it would be helpful to be aware that other people have ancestors too. And that the person who's doing something that we think is absolutely crazy and makes no sense and is horrible, that they had ancestors who taught them that that was the right way, that that was the safe way, and that they had ancestors who had reasons for that. And that we all have these interweavings of all these different stories and different experiences in our lineages. And that we are destined to just keep replaying them, like the conflict in the Middle East, like the conflicts in the British Isles, Ireland, Scotland, England, like that's been going on for a really long time. We are destined to keep repeating these if we simply allow ourselves to just be triggered and are not conscious of the unconscious stories and the physiological triggers of those old traumas. That's a whole lot of awareness to cultivate. But I'm wondering as we speak, if trauma can be laid down epigenetically, can't healing also be laid down epigenetically? And mightn't we be the people to start to lay that down for future generations? In Native North American traditions, many communities talk about the 7 generations rule, that you think about how to live your life based on how it will influence 7 generations from now. And so those are the choices we have the capacity to make. The choice to listen and be empathetic rather than be triggered and making quick assumptions. The choice to build bridges instead of walls, and the choice to cultivate healing and connection. our world is increasingly interconnected. So perhaps those are some choices that might not just serve us well, but also serve everyone who will come after us. So I'm going to thank Carol once again for some thought-provoking information and some ideas. As we move into coffee hour, you will all have the opportunity to share your thoughts about this and your questions. But I will extinguish our chalice, reminding us that the light represents always that seeking for truth, for the light of truth, and the many different ways the light of truth can appear. And the passion for justice, the passion for making the world a better place, that fire of transformation, and also the warmth of community, doing it all together. So I will extinguish our chalice as we enter our time of conversation.